Today we're going to talk about caregiving at the end of life. I'll be using some slides today from the ELNIC Consortium, which was the End of Life Nursing Education Consortium, and with their permission we are using these slides to educate you and to enlighten you about death and dying in America, which has seen great changes over the last century. In the late 1800s, there really was not a lot to offer the sick beyond the easing of symptoms that were associated with disease. Most deaths occurred at home with extended family members caring for that dying person, and most people died within days of onset of their illnesses. In the early to mid-1900s, we had a growth of science and industry, and we had sweeping changes that occurred at that time. We had improvements in living and working conditions and in sanitation. We had the advent of antibiotics that came about. CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, was then instituted during that time frame. And the focus of health care really shifted from easing suffering to curing disease. And actually at that time, patients whose disease failed to respond to treatments were given less priority, because to some healthcare professionals at that time, death itself became equated with medical failure. As we talk about death and dying in America, let's take a look. I've got several slides I want to show you. We will look at the cause of death, demographic and social trends, sites of death, and dying trajectories. First, in the cause of death and demographic and social trends, notice the comparison here on this slide. In the early 1900s, medicine's focus was just comforting the ill person. Currently, it has now changed to curing the ill person. When you look at the death rate, for example, it has greatly declined from where it was back in the early 1900s. Many people in the early 1900s died in the home, whereas now most die in institutions. In the early 1900s, the families were the only people that cared for those who were sick. Where in current times, you may have some family, you may have strangers and home health aides and other health care providers that are providing that care at the end of life. The disease and dying trajectory back in the early 1900s was relatively short. People didn't last long or live long following their illness. Currently, life is prolonged. We also have to look at our aging population to see what is driving some of the trends and the emphasis on a good death and what it might be. As you can see in this slide, since the early 1900s, projecting forward into 2040, the number of older adults is rapidly increasing. With 35 million older adults aged 65 and older in 2000, we are looking at a projection of 79.7 million in 2040. It will be approximately 1 in every 5 people will be over the age of 65. So if you're looking and thinking about this yourself, think about if you know 20 people in your contacts, probably 4 of them will be over the age of 65 in coming years. Very interesting, huh? It'll be a whole new graying world. I also want to look at the site of death, which means where are people at? Where's the dying process actually occurring? Mostly in hospitals, whereas in early years, in the 1900s, it was in the home. Some in nursing homes and some in their residence, but still largely in hospitals. This is not where people want to die, but this is where they actually are. The death is occurring. Now we want to look at a couple of slides on the dying trajectories. About less than 10% of people that experience death have what we call sudden death, an unexpected cause. Some just get a disease and have a steady decline. They may have a short terminal phase. But most often, the trajectory you see is when somebody becomes ill with a chronic illness and they have a very slow decline, and they have periodic crises where they will get better, and you can see they're coming back to the baseline, and they'll go into crisis again. They may be hospitalized and have to get other treatments, and then they'll come back. They don't ever get back to where they were at the very beginning. You can see it is a downward trajectory. Let's talk for a moment about the impact, because Americans are living longer. And the period of time of living with progressive and eventually fatal illness is generally prolonged and often marked by functional dependency on others. There is a trend toward the separation of family members by great distances. Today, it's not unusual for families to be separated by geographic distances. An individual, and if you're a young person taking this course, you may not have experienced the death of a significant other until well into your adult years. So you may not have had the death of a grandparent or even a parent and know what this experience is like. But when that occurs, persons are at risk of an increased profound emotional response to the first death and even subsequent ones after that. Even health professionals are uncomfortable many times in addressing the end-of-life concern. More research is needed to support the study of how we can make dying and accept it as a part of the normal life cycle, which it is. There is a disparity in America between the way people die and the way they want to die. Once I queried a classroom when I was teaching gerontology, and they asked me, and I asked the students, I said, if you had to have a choice, how would you like to die? 99.9% of that class said they would like to die in their sleep. They don't want to see it coming. They don't want to know about it. They just want it to happen and occur. That's usually not what happens, though, as we've seen on the dying trajectories today. Most adults do prefer to be cared for at home when we think about our patient and family perspective. The two greatest fears that are associated with death are being a burden to the family and actually being in pain. And many people have come to fear the prospect of prolonged death characterized by overtreatment and the use of life-sustaining technology and invasive, debilitating treatment. Sometimes patients and families worry that when, I guess in quotes, you could think nothing more can be done, that their health care providers will actually abandon them. Families may be very uncertain about how to provide physical care and adjust to role changes that chronic illness and sickness brings. And many families will drain their life savings in order to cover the cost of care for terminally ill family members. Let's talk about some barriers to quality care at the end of life. The realities of life-limiting diseases. There is a failure to acknowledge the limits of medicine sometimes. Sometimes there is inappropriate use of aggressive curative treatment. These treatments sometimes, if they're aggressive and curative, but yet the person is not curable, it just prolongs the dying process, and it contributes greatly to the physical and emotional distress experienced by the families and the dying person. There is not a lot of training that goes on with professionals as to how to deal and communicate with the dying person and how to communicate and address psychological, spiritual, physical needs, not only of the dying person, but those of the family as well. And many healthcare professionals are still uncomfortable communicating that bad diagnosis, that bad prognosis or news that has to occur. As a result of that, we've had some delayed access to hospice and palliative care. Mainly one is because the services are not well understood. There's a lack of understanding in the general public and in healthcare professionals to some degree of what comprehensive end-of-life programs offer, and that they're very confused sometimes when it's appropriate to consult or transfer care to these types of services. When we think about hospice and palliative care, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit later on in greater depth in defining them, these hospice and palliative care services offer aggressive, non-curative treatments and interventions. Patients and families do not feel abandoned. When we think about end-of-life care, some of the main goals of end-of-life care include controlling the pain, relieving the emotional and spiritual distress, and enhancing the patient and the family choices regarding end-of-life care. Some people delay going into hospice and palliative care, one, because they think that it's going to take away all hope of the dying client. Sometimes the regulation of controlled substances has led to a fear of, well, I don't want somebody to get addicted, and so they won't go into hospice and palliative care because they know that they're probably going to get adequate pain control, and that's part of and a goal of end-of-life care, adequate end-of-life care. But there is a fear of that. But hospice is a program, and palliative care services is a philosophy of care. And I want to talk more about each of these now. The focus of palliative care includes the control of physical symptoms, psychosocial supports of the patient and the family, and attention to spiritual needs. And hospice and palliative care both came about as an awareness, I guess you would say, of the inadequate care that's available at the end of life. It's really important to have end-of-life care closure. And a hospice program and palliative care principles enable this. So let's talk a bit more about that. What is hospice? Hospice is a program of care that is provided across a variety of settings and based on the understanding that dying is part of the normal life cycle. Hospice promotes the idea of living until you die. Hospice supports the patient through the dying process and the surviving family through the dying and the bereavement process. As we look back at the history of hospice, it began as a grassroots effort in the United States. The opening of the first hospice program in the United States was in Connecticut in 1974. Usually, eligibility is limited in hospice to those who are expected to be in the last 6 months of life. Currently, hospice is now expanding those service options so that patients and families can receive palliative care long before the last 6 months of life to meet the needs of patients that are dying from chronic illnesses. Palliative care is the prevention and relief of suffering through the management of symptoms from the early through the final stages of an illness. It attends closely to the emotional, spiritual, and practical needs and goals of patients and families. Palliative care seeks to prevent, relieve, reduce, or soothe the symptoms of disease or disorder without effecting a cure. When we look at the history of palliative care, it emerged in response to continued demands for improvement in the care and support of patients and families facing life-threatening illnesses. And services extend across the trajectory of the illness, from diagnosis till death. When we talk about the philosophy of care, both hospice and palliative care principles are based on the understanding that dying is a part of the normal life cycle, that care is focused on enhancing the quality of remaining life by integrating physical, psychological, social, and spiritual aspects of care. The interventions that occur with the family and with the patient or the individual that is dying affirm life. They don't hasten death. They don't postpone death. They aim at comforting in that process and bringing dignity in the death and dying process. One of the main goals of care for hospice and palliative care is comfort and quality end-of-life closure. When we talk about quality end-of-life closure, we're referring to the possibilities for positive experiences in the face of suffering, that people might live out their lives with dignity and die in a manner that is meaningful to them. Sometimes the goals of care change frequently as a patient approaches death. You know, palliative care measures should coexist with curative measures. If one were to introduce palliative care earlier in the course of an illness, it makes it possible to recognize when the shifts occur and allows for patients and families and even healthcare professionals to adapt the goals accordingly so that the patient's needs and the family needs are addressed. When we think about palliative care, and you look at this trajectory on your slide here, the patient and the family are the unit of care, and care is always given in a manner that reflects the personal, cultural, and religious values, the wishes, and the goals of the patient and family. There's a lot of attention, as I've said earlier, to the physical, psychological, social, and spiritual needs. When a person is first diagnosed with an illness, there is usually a curative focus with disease-specific treatments, as you see on your slide. But as I was mentioning earlier, this does change, and the focus changes. Then the focus then becomes comfort and supporting treatments all the way into death. So as we look at this and we look at these dying trajectories, the dying individual and the family must be considered together. You cannot address one without addressing both. We mentioned earlier about all the needs. It's a holistic approach to their needs. The interdisciplinary team approach, I have that on your slide so that you can realize that individuals need care not only from their healthcare providers, but perhaps from their minister, their pastor, their friends. And today I'm hoping that I can encourage you to be more comfortable with talking about and being open about the discussion about death. Education, you're enrolled in this class now, about the dying process, will make you feel less afraid to engage in a conversation with someone who may be dying, or to sit quietly at their side and listen to them while they talk about their accomplishments in life, things they didn't get to do, things they still hope to do. And perhaps it might be your role to help them in whatever career you have is to accomplish those goals, some of them before they die. When we think about the model of the quality of life, we have to look at, as I mentioned, a holistic approach: physical well-being, psychological well-being, social well-being, and spiritual well-being. Now let's take a look at each one of those so we can have a thorough understanding. When we talk about physical well-being, we're talking about pain. Most people are afraid in the dying process that they're not going to get relief from their pain. With hospice and palliative care principles, that is one of the main goals, is to alleviate the pain. Address whatever other symptoms that may be presenting, whether it's nausea, restlessness, breathlessness, and the list can go on. And not only do you look at the dying individual, look at the impact on family caregivers. Many of them become stressed. They're seeing their loved one get worse on a daily basis, and it's very hard for them. So we have to be attuned to their needs as well and talk to them and be willing to listen to them therapeutically as well. In the psychological well-being realm, there's a wide range of emotions and concerns at the end of life. Communication and support are huge. But we don't walk away from that and because we're uncomfortable with it. Hopefully, as you go through this course, you're going to become more comfortable with the process of accepting death and dying as the normal part of a life cycle. Coping strategies can be explored with families to see for those things that have been, those strategies that have been helpful in the past. They may be applicable to the current situation. Cognitive assessment, we should always be aware of the family and if they're in tune to what's going on. And many times in the dying process, the dying patient, their cognitive abilities will decrease, and we have to be aware of that. There's a lot of emotional responses to illness that are psychological concerns. And a lot of anxiety, sadness, fear, depression, and everybody has their own response and their individual response. We have to be aware, too, that the social well-being and integrity of the family may be threatened. It may be disrupted. It could be that, if the mother is the one that is sick, she has always been the caretaker of everyone else. Perhaps it's the father that's been sick, and he's always been the breadwinner in the family. Roles are changing. People can't do the same things they were able to do now that they have an illness. And most people worry about being a burden. And when they're dying, they worry about being a burden to their family. Expressions of sexuality may change between partners as that illness progresses. Children in the home, sometimes they act out. In a classroom at school, you may see themselves isolating themselves from their friends when they've been an outgoing child previously, and now they're changing. Financial concerns may arise due to lost income if the breadwinner of the family is affected. So we have to be alert and be willing to talk with people and to listen to them as we look at these possible activities that may and experiences that they are coping with and they're stressed with. And we always have to think about the spiritual well-being. A broader understanding of spirituality embraces a search for meanings in any given life experience. This very spiritual dimension involves the universal human capacity to transcend self and connect with others. Many times a person's spirituality allows them to seek meaning in their lives, to transcend losses that they've had. We have to treat patients respectfully, and we have to be respectful of the rituals in their lives and their cultural influences in their lives. Everyone is individual. It's a good thing if you know some of their rituals and their cultural experiences, but if not, be aware that that's very important. In the end-of-life care, it is very important that we are respectful and cognizant of what are the cultural rituals and activities that are very important to that individual that is dying as well as to that family. We do not treat everybody the same, but we are attuned to the individual needs and the spiritual beliefs of each. On this slide, it simply just recaps the dimensions of the quality of life that were focused that are focused upon in the application of palliative care. So that's just a review slide. Let's talk for a moment about the concept of suffering. Suffering is a state of severe distress that threatens the intactness of the person. It is a very highly personal experience. It is not a one-size-fits-all. Suffering can arise when any aspect of the person is threatened. And it is impossible for one person to assume the presence or the absence of suffering in another. We can be empathetic with that, but we really don't know exactly what they're going through. So we always have to be open and listen. People can be a source of suffering. They may be worried about their physical body and maybe how their perception of self has changed. They may be concerned about family relationships. They may be concerned about practical matters such as financial concerns. We've talked about some of those already. But suffering can occur, and everybody is individual. We just need to be aware of that. And the depth of suffering can also vary tremendously between different people as well. Sometimes when people inappropriately focus on a cure and they won't talk about let's have a good death or let's find meaning in what time we have left, let's find quality in the time that we have left. When you're denying that patient or that individual or your loved one an opportunity to express those feelings, it actually can increase their suffering. The last phase of life does provide continued opportunities for positive growth in the face of suffering, and we need to be able to allow that. The end-of-life closure can be a very personal experience and very rewarding. It might include completion of family and friend relationships. It might include the acceptance of the finality of life. It may give them new meaning about life. It allows letting them talk about it and go through this and decide what they want to do with the time that they have left, and exploring that with them lets them let go in a dignified manner and respects where they are as a person. So in conclusion today, I just want to say about the quality of life care addresses quality of life concerns, which we've talked about today. Knowledge is power, and increased knowledge is essential. For each of you that are listening to this lecture, I am hopeful that you will become more comfortable with the aspect of death and accept it as a part of the normal life cycle, not something to be avoided, but something to be accepted as you go through the course of the semester. Being with, that concept of being with, and I have that on your slide, it is a deeply emotional experience to sit by the bedside of someone who is passing on, to share that time in their life that is very meaningful to them. It also will be very meaningful to you as well. As I'm a geriatric nurse, and as I have sat at the bedside and I have worked with families, I know that some of them have said, those last few months with Mama were great times because they embraced and accepted that death is a part of the normal life cycle, and they talked about things together, things they had done, things they hoped to accomplish in the time that was left, and it became very meaningful and important. So I want to encourage you to become more comfortable and accept it. And as we end today, I want to read you an excerpt. It's by an author named Kallish, Kallish, and it's called The Horse on the Dining Room Table. So I am reading to you. It's a story. The author writes, I struggled up the slope of Mount Evmandu to meet the famous guru of Nepism, an ancient sage whose name I was forbidden to place in print. I was much younger then, but the long and arduous hike exhausted me, and despite the cold, I was perspiring heavily when I reached the plateau where he made his home. He viewed me with a patient, almost amused look, and I smiled wanly at him between attempts to gulp the thin air into my lungs. I made my way across the remaining 100 meters and slowly sat down on the ground, propping myself up against a large rock just outside his abode. We were both silent for several minutes, and I felt the tension in me rise and then subside until I was calm. Perspiration prickled my skin, but the slight breeze was pleasantly cool, and soon I was relaxed. Finally, I turned my head to look directly into the clear brown eyes, which were bright within his lined face. I realized that I would need to speak. Father, I said, I need to understand something about what it means to die before I can continue my studies. He continued to gaze at me with his open, bemused expression. Father, I went on, I want to know what a dying person feels when no one will speak with him, nor be open enough to permit him to speak about his dying. He was silent for 3, perhaps 4 minutes. I felt at peace because I knew he would answer. Finally, as though in the middle of a sentence, he said, It is the horse on the dining room table. We continued to gaze at each other for several minutes. I began to feel sleepy after my long journey, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, he was gone, and the only activity was my own breathing. I retraced my steps down the mountain, still feeling calm, knowing that his answer made me feel good, but not knowing why. I returned to my studies and gave no further thought to the event, not wishing to dwell upon it, yet secure that someday I should understand. Many years later, I was invited to the home of a casual friend for dinner. It was a modest house in a typical California development. The 8 or 10 other guests, people I did not know well, and I sat in the living room drinking Safeway scotch and bourbon and dipping celery sticks and raw cauliflower into a watery cheese dip. The conversation, initially halting, became more animated as we got to know each other and developed points of contact. The drinks undoubtedly also affected us. Eventually, the hostess appeared and invited us into the dining room for a buffet dinner. As I entered the room, I noticed with astonishment that a big brown horse was sitting quietly on the dining room table. Although it was small for a horse, it filled much of the large table. I caught my breath but didn't say anything. I was the first one to enter, so I was able to turn to watch the other guests. They responded much as I did. They entered, saw the horse, gasped or stared, but said nothing. The host was the last to enter. He let out a silent shriek, looking rapidly from the horse to each of his guests with a wild stare. His mouth formed soundless words. Then, in a voice choked with confusion, he invited us to fill our plates from the buffet. His wife, equally disconcerted by what was clearly an unexpected horse, pointed to the name cards which indicated where each of us was to sit. The hostess led me to the buffet and handed me a plate. Others lined up behind me, each of us quiet. I filled my plate with rice and chicken and sat in my place. The other guests followed suit. I was cramped, sitting there trying to avoid getting too close to the horse, while pretending no horse was there. My dish overlapped the edge of the table. Others found other ways to avoid physical contact with the horse. The host and hostess seemed as ill at ease as the rest of us. The conversation lagged. Every once in a while, someone would say something in an attempt to revive the earlier pleasant and innocuous discussion. But the overwhelming presence of the horse so filled our thoughts that talks of taxes or politics or the lack of rain seemed inconsequential. Dinner ended, and the hostess brought coffee. I can recall everything on my plate, and yet I have no memory of having eaten. We drank in silence, all of us trying not to look at the horse, yet unable to keep our eyes or thoughts anywhere else. I thought several times of saying, "Hey, there's a horse on the dining room table," but I hardly knew the host, and I didn't wish to embarrass him by mentioning something that obviously discomforted him at least as much as it discomforted me. After all, it was his house, and what do you say to a man with a horse on his dining room table? I could have said that I did not mind, but that was not true. Its presence upset me so much that I enjoyed neither the dinner nor the company. I could have said that I knew how difficult it was to have a horse on your dining room table, but that wasn't true either. I had no idea. I could have said something like, "How do you feel about having a horse on your dining room table?" But I didn't want to sound like a psychologist. Perhaps I thought, if I ignore it, it will go away. Of course, I knew that it wouldn't, and it didn't. I later learned that the host and hostess were hoping the dinner would be a success in spite of the horse. They felt that to mention it would make us so uncomfortable that we wouldn't enjoy our visit. Of course, we didn't enjoy the evening anyway. They were fearful that we would try to offer them sympathy, which they didn't want, or understanding, which they needed but could not accept. They wanted the party to be a success, so they decided to try to make the evening as enjoyable as possible. but it was apparent that they, like their guests, could think of little else than the horse. I excused myself shortly after dinner and went home. The evening had been terrible. I never wanted to see the host and hostess again, although I was eager to seek out the other guests and learn what they felt about the occasion. I felt confused about what had happened and extremely tense. The evening had been grotesque. I was careful to avoid the host and hostess after that, and I did my best to stay away altogether from the entire neighborhood. Recently, I visited the guru once more. He was still alive, although nearing death, and he would speak to only a few. I repeated my journey and eventually found myself sitting across from him. Once again, I asked, "Father, I want to know what a dying person feels when no one will speak with him, nor be open enough to permit him to speak about his dying." The old man was quiet, and we sat without speaking for nearly an hour. Since he did not bid me leave, I remained. Although I was content, I feared he would not share his wisdom, but he finally spoke. The words came slowly. "My son, it is the horse on the dining room table. It is a horse that visits every house and sits on every dining room table, the table of the rich, the poor, the simple, and the wise. This horse just sits there, but its presence makes you wish to leave without speaking of it. If you leave, you will always fear the presence of the horse. When it sits on your table, you will wish to speak of it, but you may not be able to do so. However, if you speak about the horse, you will find that others can also speak about the horse, most others at least, if you are gentle and kind as you speak. The horse will remain on the dining room table, but you will not be so distraught. You will enjoy your repast, and you will enjoy the company of the host and hostess. Or if it is your table, you will enjoy the presence of your guests. You cannot make magic to have the horse disappear, but you can speak of the horse and thereby render it less powerful." That's the end of the excerpt, and what I want you to understand from that is that we need to openly acknowledge that death and dying is part of the life cycle. With this acceptance and acknowledgement will come a more comfortable sense and ability to talk with those other people that are dying, their families. It may even be for you and your family one day as death approaches. Conversation and acknowledgement of death and dying are very comforting and can increase the comfort and decrease the stress that a family has. So increasing your knowledge, being open to talk about it, are good things, and these are things that I hope you learn well in our course. Thank you so much.